It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Debra Pepler. Dr. Pepler is a registered psychologist here in Ontario. She has been a professor in the Department of Psychology here at York University for 25 years. And before that, I understand at the University of Toronto as well. In addition, she is a senior associate scientist at the Hospital for Sick Children. She has the title of Distinguished Researcher, whose research on children at risk with peer relationships at school and in the context of family has really changed the way that we think about bullying and aggression amongst our young people. She's the co-founder of PrevNet, and if you're like me, you've been wondering for a while what that PREV stands for. Prevention, prevalence, previous, none of the above. Of course, it stands for Promoting Relationships and Eliminating Violence Network. Dr. Pepler's research has won her at least 4 honorable awards. I'll bet it's more than that. That's as much as she's put up on her website. For her outstanding contributions to knowledge, education, and community service. And her research has resulted in the co-authoring of 4 books, dozens of journal articles, dozens of book chapters, reviews, and government reports. She speaks around the world on these topics, and today we get to hear her live and in person. Welcome, Dr. Debra Pepler.
Great. Well, it's just an amazing honor to be here, and I must admit I feel quite humbled. You're experts in the room. I see many faces I know and many experts whom I know, and I'm on a journey. The lovely thing about being in the last half of one's career is that you don't need to drive quite as much, and you can stop and explore a bit. And this is an area that I've been exploring because it totally fascinates me, how we support the healthy development of children who have some differences, some disabilities, some challenges, and yet deserve, the very fullest life and optimal development. And some of that comes at the cost of peers, and that's what bullying's about. So I'm really looking forward to sharing with you. I'm most grateful to Jonathan, who's helped me on my journey, and I'll share some of the research that we've been doing. But mostly I'm going to talk about our developing understanding of bullying, and based on the work that we've done for the last 25 years. And I really support the development of this network. If we've learned anything in the work we've done is you can't do this alone, and the people who have the best knowledge are in fact not the researchers. The people who have the best knowledge are the people on the ground, because they know what tools are needed, they know what training is needed, they know what messages are needed, and by working together you can make a huge difference. And so I'll talk a bit about that. I was challenged to prepare this talk for a talk I gave in Columbia, where they think very openly and, from my perspective, in really fresh ways about integrating children who are different and have disabilities. And I realized that in talking about children on the autism spectrum, that the discussion we have could really be about any children who are different or any children who have challenges. So there are similar issues that arise regardless of the disability or challenge that a child has. And very similar issues arise for children who are different in some way, that have something that sets them apart from their peers, as they may also be vulnerable to what in some way are very normal peer processes, and we can talk about those, that put these children out on the margins, and they're just not safe when they're on the margins of our social groups. So these are just my brief objectives. I'd like to define bullying for you and help you understand a bit about the complex dynamics that unfold in bullying, describe the challenges in preventing bullying for children with ASD, and then talk about prevention and intervention strategies. And what we've learned through PrevNet, which is this network that we work with 65 researchers and 52 national organizations, is people really need tools. They need something in their hands. In fact, right now we're trying to develop fact sheets and tools for teachers to intervene in bullying. And, you know, sometimes they really just want scripts to, you know, how do I approach this? What do I say? You know, what are the steps? How do I approach the other children? So we need to think about this collectively because it's a big job. So let's talk about defining bullying. One of the big developments in our work is that we've come to understand bullying not just as an aggressive behavior problem, which is exactly the way it was understood in the 80s when we started this research, but it's a relationship problem. It's a problem that unfolds in the context of a relationship between a child who's bullying and a child who's victimized. And if you listen, I won't label children as bullies and victims because those labels, as you're well aware, constrain thinking about that child and about the challenges that that child faces. The difficulty with this relationship is that it unfolds over time. And as it unfolds over time, that the child who's bullying in this context increases in power, and the child who's being victimized decreases in power in the context of that relationship. And bullying's all about power. It's about a power differential and someone using power aggressively to cause distress to another. So the difficulty is that when children bully, they learn how, quote unquote, effective and adaptive it can be to use your power aggressively. Not only do you cause this other child to submit and become distressed, but it actually increases for children who are socially skilled, it increases their popularity in the peer group. Exactly the opposite of what we'd want. So those children are learning this lesson about how to interact, and they carry this lesson forward through adolescence and into adulthood. And the difficulty is that the children who are being victimized become increasingly trapped in a relationship in which they don't have power. And often we as adults will say, well, just stand up for yourself. Use your words. The trouble is they can do everything and it won't change that because they're completely powerless. And in talking to children who've been victimized, I've asked what have they tried, and they've been so creative in trying many, many things. Change their shoes, change the way they walk, change the way they talk. Nothing works because after repeated episodes, they virtually have no power to disrupt that relationship and the power dynamics in that relationship. So what we need to do is take that negative power or the capacity for negative power away from the child who's being victimized and empower the child who's being victimized in different ways. What we learned by stepping into a child's world is that it's necessary but not sufficient to fill children up with social skills. If their experiences in the social group are not such that they're included, that they're respected, that they're safe, that they get an opportunity to interact with children in a positive way, they aren't going to be learning the very things that we need them to learn, and they aren't going to be safe. And we started out today talking about mental health problems, and having these kinds of stressful experiences in the peer group is a strong risk indicator for a whole range of mental health problems. So what we learned was that bullying is not only a relationship problem, but it's a relationship problem that unfolds in the context of the peer group. And peers can be part of the problem or part of the solution. And of course, what our prevention and intervention strategies need to do is ensure that they're part of the solution and not part of the problem. Bullying is about power. I mentioned that before. And power comes in lots of ways that we as adults don't recognize. It may be size or age and things that are obvious to us, but it's other things that are less obvious, such as social status in groups, a knowledge of another child's vulnerabilities, and that vulnerability can be a disability or a difference, but it can also be a vulnerability related to socioeconomic status, related to parents' mental health, one's own mental health,
children have radar for differences. It's their job to figure out who's like them, who's not like them, who they want to play with, who they don't want to play with. And those natural processes push children who are different to the margins. And it's not that they can't and don't enjoy interacting with children who are different, but they're very natural processes that push these children to the margins where they don't have opportunities to engage. So in terms of peer dynamics, when we look at bullying on our playground tapes, we find that 85% of the time there are other children watching. This is not a solitary activity. This is an activity that signals status, that signals dominance, that signals peer processes to other children, and they come and watch. They want to figure out who's doing what to whom. So as the children are watching, their attention and their reinforcement reflects the dynamic of power. 75% of the time they're giving reinforcement to or joining with the child who's doing the bullying, and 25% of the time they're paying attention to or supporting the child who's being victimized. What we really want to do is flip that dynamic. Peers intervene in bullying more frequently than teachers. Why? Because they're there most of the time. Children know that we don't approve of bullying, so they simply don't do it when adults are watching. So when we didn't have a bullying prevention program, peers intervened about 11% of the time. When we were in schools doing a bullying prevention program, which is now standard and required by law, children intervened 22% of the time. When a child intervenes in bullying, it's highly effective. Bullying stopped, in our videos, bullying stopped within 10 seconds, 57% of the time. Now you might say, well, how effective is that? I just challenge you to think about how often your children stopped within 10 seconds when you said, turn the computer off, come for dinner, turn the TV off, come for dinner. I can tell you I have 3 children, and when they were in elementary school, they never came within 10 seconds. So why does it happen so quickly? Because children are highly, highly, highly attuned to peer behaviors, to peer interactions, to their status in the peer group. And it's not that the children who bully do a cost-benefit analysis, but as soon as another child challenges that, they tend to back off and stop. This relates to how Jonathan started today, to that developmental contextual model. When we think about assessment or intervention, we need to think in a binocular way. And it's only by thinking in that way that we can really understand in depth. We need to think, yes, about the individual child and what that child's strengths are, what that child's needs are, but that's just not going to be enough. We also have to think about how that child's doing in the context of relationships, in the context of relationships within the family, within the classroom with peers, within the classroom perhaps with an ED or an educational assistant, with the teacher in the broader school context, and in the community. So the relationships in which a child's embedded are critical to that child's development. So the key messages here, just that bullying is a relationship problem. It's very complex in that, you know, children bring their own vulnerabilities and their own styles of interaction to a relationship. And then it unfolds in the context of a peer group where there are a lot of reinforcement contingencies happening. And we as adults are responsible for this. And peers can be part of the solution, or as it unfolds naturally, they're most often part of the problem. So let's talk about preventing bullying for children with ASD. I'm sure you're familiar with this social model of disability, but for me it really rang true in terms of what I think children need and deserve. And the notion is that an individual's social environment determines to a large extent, and I guess the physical environment too, to a large extent to which their disabilities are actually disabling, to which they really aren't able to engage in life in the fullest way depends on the ways others treat them and others accept them and others interact with them. So the interactions within the family, school, peer, and community context are really, really important. And this moves us away from a medical model of disability, that that there are problems, you do your best to solve them, you put some Band-Aids and supports on, give some crutches, whatever it is, but not a sense that this is quite dynamic and moving. So it's looking at all individuals as having capacity and trying to maximize that. And for me, the meaningful part of this is it's about relationships, because that's where I've ended up in terms of my career, understanding how incredibly important relationships are in children's lives for brain development, for genetic expression, for social and emotional and behavioral regulation, for everything. And children who grow up in stressful relationships experience many, many challenges from the cell to the society. So it guides us to think then not only about how this child is developing and what skills this child needs, but to think much more broadly about what do the teachers need in the school where this child is living? What do the peers need to understand this child and to connect and interact with this child? And this focus on the quality of relationships that a child experiences is really essential to the issue of bullying prevention. So for all children, healthy relationships are essential. They're important throughout development, and there's a growing recognition of the importance of relationship. There have been some articles in the paper about social isolation among the elderly and how it cuts short the lifespan. There was an article this weekend about children who live in disadvantaged environments. And if you read carefully, it's largely about the quality of relationships that they have. Because what we're discovering, well, no, I'm not discovering it at all, what people are discovering who do this work in genetics and epigenetics and brain development is that it's the stress in the context of relationships that really undermines development. So the quality of relationships in which a child's growing up affect all aspects of their development. And who's responsible for the quality of relationships that children grow up in? We are, very clearly, as parents, as teachers, as coaches, as anybody involved in a child's life. It's our responsibility that they have, high quality relationships and full access to the spectrum of opportunities that they need to learn to develop into a full citizen. And these are the kinds of issues that are in the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. And our government is being challenged by Canada's lack of attention to these things. And so there are real opportunities to come together and help children who are at the margins experience these kinds of positive relationships. Peer relationships can be challenging for children who are disabled or different, and I think in the context of children with ASD they can be especially challenging. And that is because these children bring social differences. They struggle, as you know much better than I do, with social understanding, with social competence, with all of the social skills that are required for complex, reciprocal, synchronous interactions that form the foundation of caring relationships. So I want to just talk for a minute about what happens with children who are different and why there isn't a lot of peer support for them that unfolds naturally. And that has to do with processes in the peer group. As I mentioned before, children have radar for differences. They figure out who's different and who's similar, and they tend to distance themselves from children who are different, and especially children who are unpredictable. So when we did our videoing, what we found that were children who are highly aggressive did much more of what we call a mixed behavior, or we could have called it an unpredictable behavior, than normally developing children. And so they would come up to somebody and say, "Oh, you're so pretty. Oh, I hate you." And you know, "Do you want to play a game?" "Oh, you're stupid." And the other children, you could see that was like, "What are you doing?" Or, you know, "You're awful. Oh, do you want to play?" And so it's totally unpredictable because we expect there to be some synchrony, some continuity in the valence, in the emotional tone of an interaction. So when somebody comes up and does something aggressive and then right after asks you to play, your very natural reaction is to back up and go, you know. And for children with ASD, this is a part of the problem, that they're unpredictable, they do behaviors that are sometimes difficult for other children to understand, and the very, very natural reactions in children's peer groups is to find somebody who's like you, with whom you feel comfortable interacting, and that's the person you play with at recess. That's the person you sit with at lunchtime. And so our role as adults in any context is to override that and start to build the bridges and start to build the understanding about why this child is different, what the differences are, and what the challenges are that that child faces. And much more importantly, what you can do to help this child so that he or she doesn't struggle so much, and what you might be doing inadvertently that makes it much more difficult for that child. So there are ways in which we can sensitize children, engage them in interactions, and truly make a difference. I'm doing a little bit of work, and that's where I'm going to be this afternoon, with some graduate students in our program, in a school where there's a classroom that has 6 boys who are on the spectrum. And they're really struggling to integrate these children. And from my perspective, in my way of thinking, some of the biggest problems are with the adults and not the children. These children in the class are being trained in the kind of social skills you would imagine, such as saying good morning. And one cheery little boy came down the hall a couple of weeks ago, and the teacher was waiting for him, and he said hello to one of the teachers in the class, one of the other teachers in the school, and that teacher just sort of looked at him and scorned at him and then walked away. What happens? What happens for a child when we do that? Do you think he doesn't notice? We notice at a very core, deep level how people interact with us and care about that. I think we have a lot to do in helping other professionals, not the professionals in the classroom, because they're extraordinary, just extraordinary in creating a safe, caring, positive learning environment. But these children and the professionals in that classroom are in a completely toxic environment, where the teachers say, "I don't want that child in my class." "All right, you can integrate that child for 15 minutes of math." So the child comes in, the math lesson has started, gets 15 minutes in the middle, and then has left, and then has to leave. Is that the way to integrate? Is that the way to create positive relationships? They've started to do some building around relationships in terms of bringing small groups, 6 children from another classroom in, and I was there when this happened. They helped the children understand what was different about these children before they came into the classroom, a week before, and I saw them on their second visit. The children could not have been more positive and beautiful in their interactions with these boys. They were patient, they were warm, they were humorous, they were delightful, and had a wonderful time. The child care worker went out and asked them if they had any questions. Did they want to ask any questions? They said, "No, but that was really fun. Can we come again?" They learned a lot. The boys who were in the class had really happy, joyful interactions that were structured. There was a structure to it. But, there's tremendous, tremendous potential in ensuring that children with differences have structured opportunities for positive interactions with the other children. What does that take? It takes adults who care for these children, respect these children, understand how important it is for them to be integrated, and respond to them as any child should be responded to, with respect and warmth rather than dismissal. So, children with disabilities and differences are bullied at a much higher rate than children without differences. Why do they lack support? Well, I think social modeling by the teachers probably is among the most important thing. We see in our tapes teachers dismissing children, telling them they don't want to talk to them. One of the things about studying aggressive children, and it may be the case for some children with autism, is they're not very fun to interact with. Let's just be honest. Who wants a whiny, disruptive, dysregulated child interacting with you? But we're professionals. It's our job to learn to rise up to the occasion and ensure that our relationship with any given child is respectful and warm and caring. Because it's only in the context of that kind of relationship that we can set the limits and do the kind of teaching that we want to do. If children don't think we care, it's very clear they're not going to be willing to learn. Very clear. There's in-group favoritism, as I explained to you. Peers like to play with children who are like them, and it's not that they dislike the other children, but they're just disinterested in them. They don't know them, they're hard to play with. And disability isn't addressed, and I think this is really important. We talk about integration of any children with differences. Parents often say, you can't tell the other children that my child stutters, or that my child has Tourette's, or that my child has autism. Let's just not tell them. Are you kidding? Are you kidding? They figured it out within 5 minutes. It takes 30 minutes for a group of peers to reject an aggressive child. No time at all to figure out whether this is somebody you want to play with or somebody who's so different you choose not to. So what we have to do is put the difference on the table. Talk about it. Help them understand it. Ask questions. Give them opportunities to ask any questions about it. And then structure their learning so they can think about what it is that I can do that's going to make it easier for this child who's different. And what might I be doing that makes it more difficult? And if I'm bullying him, if I'm teasing him, if I'm ignoring him or her, it's going to be more difficult. I think my biggest learning in this field, and one of the reasons that I'm on this journey, is something that I confess to you I didn't understand until the last year, come to grips with, which is that every child who's living with autism in whatever form desperately wants to have peer relationships with his or her own age mates. We're built as social beings. At our very core is connectedness. And even if it doesn't look like these children want to be included, want to be connected, because they lack the capacity to show that and to engage in it, it's a very core need and motivation. In fact, for children in elementary and early high school, the strongest need, their strongest motivation is not to get an A in math or in English or to be, an Olympic athlete. Their strongest motivation is to have friends. And that's why bullying is so hurtful, because you're distanced and you're damaged by your peers. So we have to keep that in mind. So social isolation, as you could see on the tape, places children at risk for victimization by their peers. Children who are at the social margins aren't protected because they don't have other children around them. They're very vulnerable, as this little boy was, totally disconnected. The only time children interacted with him was around the toy that he had. And children with special needs are bullied about twice as much as their peers. And what they bring is a lack of social skills and a lack of social understanding, and that then increases their vulnerability because they're just less able to integrate, to build friendships, because they don't stand on the same foundation as the other children. This is work, whoops, I went by too quickly. This is a study that Jonathan and I did with Catherine Cappadocios, who's one of my doctoral students, on the prevalence of bullying among children and youth with ASD. So We had 268 parents of children who had been diagnosed from across Canada. It was a web-based survey. 75% of parents reported that their child had been bullied at school within the last month. That is huge. That relates to a report of maybe 5 to 10% of typically developing children. It's just huge. And 45% report that bullying has persisted for more than a year. So these are very, very high rates. And when bullying has persisted for a long period of time, as you'll recall, the power differential becomes greater. The ability for the child to be safe is lessened. And so that child is experiencing more and more distress and more abuse at the hands of peers as it goes on. Verbal and social victimization were most common. This is also the case for typically developing children in our videotapes. Verbal and social victimization was most common. 66% of parents reported that their children had experienced both of these forms of victimization. And children who were victimized compared to those who were not had higher levels of conduct problems, anxiety, hyperactivity, and oversensitivity. These are correlational data. We can't tell whether the conduct problems came before and it's a result of that child being so dysregulated that that child is seen as different and vulnerable by peers, or whether it comes after. In our longitudinal research, we followed children from grade 5, 6, and 7 through the end of high school for 7 years. These problems arise as a result of victimization. So a child who's not victimized becomes victimized, develops more externalizing problems such as conduct problems, as well as more internalizing problems such as anxiety and depression. 28% of parents, oops, I'm going backwards there, that's, okay. I seem to have that one twice. 28% of the parents reported their child had also bullied another child. And you know these children, they are sometimes dysregulated. It takes much more work to help them regulate their behaviors and emotions. And so it's not surprising that sometimes they're aggressive with others, particularly if they're at the receiving end of it. And the majority of children in our data who bullied others had also been victimized. And this group of children who are involved in both roles are at highest risk for mental health problems in our data and the data of many other people. So again, we come back to this binocular perspective and think about prevention and intervention. How do we work with these children who have challenges? We need to focus on supporting the child's development in whatever way we can, but that might be limited. That might be limited when you're working with children who have disabilities or differences. You can't change someone's race. You can't change their level of intelligence. You can optimize it. You can't change the fact that a child who has a diagnosis of ASD has that diagnosis. You can optimize their skills, but that child is who he or she is and needs to be respected and included and safe and supported in all of the relationships in which they're growing up. And the study we did suggests they really aren't safe in the context of their peer relationships. So when we take the focus on the child, the questions to ask are, how is this child doing? What are the child's strengths? What are they capable? What's he or she capable of? What are his or her challenges that we need to think about? How can we support the child in meeting those challenges and in performing as well as they possibly can in the context? The other focus we need to take is a systemic or relationship focus. How are this child's relationships within the family? How are they with teachers, with classmates in the general school? Is this child integrated into any community activities? And I think we often forget about community activities, and they're so important in a child's life, and support that child in many different ways. How do others interact with this child? And that's really important. And I'm a little discouraged, I have to say. I don't know how we change these attitudes, especially in the current times when there's so much discomfort in the education system. But we're developing, what I'm doing with the graduate students with whom I'm working is to develop a training module to try to help the classroom teachers who aren't involved in the special needs classes to understand how important it is that these children are integrated and have positive relationships with the children in their classes, and age-appropriate relationships. You know, one of the solutions in this school was we could put this grade 5 boy into the grade 3 gym class. And, you know, it's one of the higher functioning. The teacher said, oh, Deb, he would be, I'm just not letting them do that. He would be so discouraged. He would be so humiliated. And he would constantly be asking the question, why am I here? You could structure that a little differently. Just let me stop for a second. If you said to this boy, we really need a leader here. We really need extra help. We need somebody to help hand out the balls. Can you be that special person? There are lots of ways to structure experiences for children where it increases their sense of self and increases their sense of capacity. But, you know, marginalizing them in a class where they just wouldn't be happy doesn't make sense. That's not where they want to be. They want to be with other grade 5 boys or grade 5 children. And then what can we do to promote healthy relationships? You know, now that we have the research that's helping us understand how brains development, how genes change, how genes erode with exposure to violence, we can get under the skin. And that argument, I'm hoping is going to help people think about things differently. You know, the quality of a child's life literally shapes brain development and gene expression and well-being and health. So I'm hoping that might help people understand why it is that we need to promote healthy relationships. So I've talked about this. You know, the challenge in working with any child with a disability is that you may not be able to shift much. You can do as much as you possibly can, and that's wonderful. But that means the relationships have to shift and be more accommodating and be more supportive. So these are just the key messages. You know, the experience of disability arises from the way others treat you and accept you. The natural processes in the peer group isolate the child from peer support. So we have to reverse those processes and work actively to doing that. And it's difficult or sometimes impossible for children to change if they are disabled. And so the shift has to come in the other direction in the quality of their relationships. So let's just, for the last few minutes, move to prevention and intervention. And here, you know, here's my hard line. I think we have to change the adults in order to change things for children and youth. We got this wonderful opportunity to develop PrevNet. We have a federal government Networks of Centers of Excellence grant. We weren't quite sure what we'd applied for, but when we got it, David Phipps, who's here, came to me and said, Deb, this is so exciting, it's just so exciting. Then we went back and read the fine print on the grant application, and it said, we're going to give you $400,000 a year, but with this $400,000 a year, you have to bring about social cultural change in Canada. And it's like, all right, that sounds like a pretty big job. You know, and you think about, well, how do we change things for every child and youth in the country? Because that's our goal, to promote healthy relationships and prevent bullying for every child and youth in the country. How do you reach them? I've done enough talks in gyms with 300 children to tell you that is probably the worst way to reach children and youth. Mostly because the teachers tend to be at the back having coffee and talking to each other, and after, you know, my 45 minutes, it'll take another 45 minutes before everything I've said has gone away. So what we realized was that in order to reach every child and youth, we had to reach them through the organizations that reached them. That in order to reach every child and youth, we had to enhance the practices of the adults who work with those children and youth. And that's why we've worked with national organizations, the Teachers Federation, the Principals Association, the Association for Mental Health, sports organizations, media organizations, etc. So it's by doing that that we can begin to help the adults understand what their role is in socializing children. And that's really what needs to happen. Because adults serve as role models and mentors and guides. And if you haven't been onto YouTube and seen a video called Children See, Children Do, you should really go on and look at it. It's a hard-hitting Australian public service announcement and shows in just such strident terms how it is that we as adults model behavior for children and youth. Children see, children do. This is especially important when we're dealing with children who are different or disabled, because we're modeling how to include these children, or conversely, how to exclude these children. It's completely fine if a child says good morning to you, not to respond, but to scowl at him. What part of normal human interaction says that's okay? No part of it, none. So we teach children through our explicit teaching and advice, but also by ignoring a child, by turning a blind eye, by our actions and facial expressions. And what we as adults tend to forget is it's like we're on stage for children and youth. Like, they watch us all the time because that's how they learn. And if we scowl at a child who's different, they're going to feel completely right doing that themselves. So it's probably the most important message, and I think it's the hardest message to give to people. They forget that the quality of their relationship with that child not only affects that child's development in a very primary way, but also affects the way other children interact with that child. So we've drawn upon the metaphor from Bruner and Vygotsky and others of scaffolding, or coaching, we sometimes use that word, but the notion that we as adults are responsible for providing learning opportunities that enable a child to do a little bit better than he or she normally would. So the kind of reminders that teachers give students before they go out to recess, or giving them suggestions of what kind of game to play so they can engage other children, giving them a bit of equipment and coaching them in how to engage other children. And the scaffolding can be moment to moment, such as that type of coaching. But it can also be programmatic in our social skills training program, which has now become the SNAP program, Stop Now and Plan program, which out of interest is being adapted for use with children on the spectrum. But is a programmatic way where you systematically train children in the skills that they need. So scaffolding is really important for children's individual development. But that's not enough. The other term that we've coined is social architecture. And this is the notion that we as adults are responsible for the quality of relationships, the school climate, the quality of relationships, whatever you want to call it. And it's very clear we're responsible for creating safe and inclusive contexts. And sometimes it requires, many times, it requires that we arrange groups. Because what we know from our videos particularly is that the children who are highly aggressive are at the margins, but they get together. And then do they bully? You bet. Long periods of time, each other, other children. It's just a frenetic, aggressive interaction. They should never be allowed to play together on the school playground. Do we have that capacity to say, you and you cannot play together because every time you do, you're aggressive and you get into trouble? Sure, we have that kind of option. And we also have the responsibility to teach those children that they have to do it differently, that they can't exclude, they can't bully. They need to understand how to use their power positively rather than negatively. Similarly, there are very isolated children who need to be included. So you think about how teachers organize their classroom activities, and they might say, oh, we're about to do a group project. Choose your groups. Choose your groups. And these are the associative processes. Children who are like each other get together. The really smart kids get together. The jocks get together. The really deviant children get together. And then there are 2 or 3 children left. And the teacher says, well, somebody has to take Jennifer. Well, I had her last week. I can't bear to have her in my group again. And somebody else goes, well, I had her 2 weeks ago. I'm not taking it. You know, and it's just a public display of humiliation. And it's just wrong. So instead of doing that, instead of letting the children do what they naturally do that excludes some children, we have to take authority and ensure that children aren't humiliated and are included and are safe and are supported. So we also have to scaffold for peers who bully or peers who stand around. The children who stand around say, oh, I wasn't involved, I was just watching. For sure they're involved. Just watching makes it last longer. When children join in, which they often do, it makes the child who's initiated it become more aggressive and more excited. You're either part of the problem or part of the solution. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So they need to build skills and awareness. We need to help children understand how to get power positively rather than negatively. For the peers who bully and who are involved, we need to help them build relationships. This is not something that occurs naturally, and yet when we structure it, it can be so supportive. My first experience with this was probably more than 10 years ago. Some researchers from the UK came over and showed a video of a support group approach, a circle of support. And they identified 6 volunteers in a class around a child who had autism, John. He was in grade 7. And they were videotaping, and they really struggled to have this child sit still. And the teacher said, oh, you'll never get John to sit still for 45 minutes to do your filming. And they said, we really need to film for 45 minutes. He needs to stay still. And the other children said, oh, it's no problem at all. Just give him something big to hold, and he'll sit there holding this big thing. Out came the telephone book, and John sat happily for 45 minutes. So the children understand better than we do. Also, it was just lovely. There was a video of John waiting in line to play basketball, and he was really agitated, and he wanted his turn. And the girl behind him just put her hand on his shoulder and said, John, it'll be your turn in just a minute. Just be patient. And you could literally see him downregulate. You could watch his body relax, and he was just able to wait that other 30 seconds until it was his turn. So children can be so sensitive, and they're there with these children. They're there in the moment. And we need to help them understand what it is that they can do to support these children. For children who are themselves being bullied, the primary issue is protection. And how do we protect them? There are ways that we can structure their lives. There may be ways that we can give them some words to be assertive. But when we're talking about children who are struggling with social capacity, to start with, this may only be possible to a certain extent. But it doesn't mean that that child is any less deserving of being protected and being included. And the difficulty is that schools or parents often feel that schools aren't doing enough to protect these children, and I tend to agree in terms of that. There may be some things that we can do, and these are the types of things that are generally taught. There may be some self-calming strategies when children react to aggression, to bullying, either by being aggressive or by being submissive. It tends to go on. It signals that it's been successful. Teaching them to ignore if they can, finding a caring adult or caring peers, communicating assertively. Some of these things may be possible, some not, and I think that's important to remember. There are things that the schools can do to ensure that policies are being upheld and applied consistently to every child in the school. I will tell you, a child who's ignored and scorned at by a teacher for saying good morning is not safe. Not safe. Everyone needs to be inclusive and caring. Work with staff about safety plans and intervention plans. Communication between home and school is tremendously important between teachers and and administration. Finding a trusted adult in the school is important to ensure that the youth is protected. This is circles of support. From a social architecture perspective, you can find pro-social peers to work and play with them. Children are very happy to volunteer to be in a circle of support. They need help from an adult for this or the buddy system, but great opportunities to do this. The other issue is you need to educate the other children around what the difference is. And in some sense, this is the respectful way of going forward. If we expect these children to be inclusive with this child, to be warm and caring, we need to help them understand the difference, because it's only by understanding the difference that they can override their natural processes to distance themselves from somebody who's so different. And so putting it on the table, working with the parent, working sometimes even with the child who's experiencing the disability. I know that teachers sometimes go around with their class and talk about these issues and explain it with some of the children. Talk about positive strategies and support strategies. So really engaging the other children in a respectful educational process needs to precede the expectation that they'll be inclusive. So, the key messages here, just to sum up, is that it's all about the adults. It's all about our capacity to create contexts in which healthy relationships are developing, because it's in that context that the 5 C's are developing that Jonathan talked about, the really critical elements of being a healthy social being in our society. We can scaffold or coach to promote understanding and skills. We can do social architecture to shift the dynamics from the natural, sometimes quite negative dynamics to very positive and supportive dynamics that really discourage bullying and hurtful behavior. I've talked about the UN Convention of Rights of the Child. I think this is the strongest place for us to stand. Every child has the right to be safe. Every child has the right to full education, and education of all of his or her capacities. And it's our responsibility as an adult involved with children's lives to ensure that that's happening. This is just about PrevNet. It's really been a wonderful opportunity for us to come together to ensure that these children are supportive. Adults in community, adults in schools, adults working with children and youth need help in understanding why relationships are so important, and what is it about the things that they can do that make those relationships important. This is just a sense of our partners, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Scouts, Guides, Red Cross does fabulous violence prevention programs, Teachers Association, Family Service Association. We just tried to open up to many of the national organizations. And it's been exciting. We're now about 6 years into the process, 10 years since we started working with some of our national organizations. You know, and even the taxi driver tells me that, you know, the bullying work I've done is really getting into the schools. My 3-year-old daughter comes home, or grade 3 daughter comes home and tells me all about the bullying prevention that they're learning. I think, well, if the taxi drivers are talking about it, maybe we've started to make a difference. So thank you so much for the work that you do to support learning among adults, to really support changes for some of the most marginalized and at-risk children in our society who really deserve the richest relationships in their family, in their school, in their peer groups, and in their communities. Thanks so much.